Hello and welcome to Bite My Pi. Well, we couldn't very well have a tech channel with the word Pi in it without having a video about the Raspberry Pi, could we? Now, of course, I'm not talking about the dessert. What I'm referring to here is the single board computer. So in this video we'll be going through the steps of how to set one up. First, we'll look at what hardware you need to get up and running. Then we'll walk through the process of installing the software so that you end up with a fully usable operating system. So if you've bought a Raspberry Pi or are thinking of buying one and aren't sure where to start, stick around. Okay, so let's first consider the hardware. Now, when you buy a Raspberry Pi, unlike a traditional computer, when you take it out of the box, it literally looks as if all you've got is a circuit board, which in effect that's what it is. Hence the name single board computer. All of the components are physically attached, soldered onto that single board. The downside to such a bare bones system is that we need some additional hardware peripherals to actually make the computer work. Not that you can complain when you look at everything you're actually getting for such a low price point. The Raspberry Pi is an absolutely fantastic bargain. Still, let's go through the list of other parts that we need. Obviously we've got the Raspberry Pi itself, so we can check that one off the list. The Raspberry Pi doesn't have any onboard storage, so there is no hard drive. So that being the case, we need something to store the data on, and the Pi uses a micro SD card for this purpose. I'd recommend getting at least a 16GB card, as we're going to be putting a full fat operating system on it, complete with programs, and it's nice to have some space left over for your own files, so the bigger the better really. Also try and get one of the fastest class 10 models. The SD card is probably one of the biggest bottlenecks when it comes to performance on a Raspberry Pi, so try and get one that's as fast as possible. It's also a good idea to stick with a branded name, something like a Kingston or SanDisk. So let's check the micro SD card off the list. We're also going to need a power supply. Unlike previous generations of the Raspberry Pi, the latest Pi 4 uses a USB Type-C connector to deliver its power. Unfortunately, early models had an issue whereby some third-party power bricks wouldn't work. Fortunately, this has now been resolved, and if you stick to purchasing the recommended official Raspberry Pi power supply, it won't be a problem anyway. Now, we need to be able to interact with our Raspberry Pi, so for this purpose we're going to need a monitor or TV to connect to it with at least one HDMI input. You'll also need a HDMI cable. Now, previous Pis use standard HDMI cables, but if you've got the newest Pi 4, you'll need a micro HDMI to full-size HDMI cable, as the ports on the latest Pi have changed. Next up, we need a USB keyboard, and unless you're a complete keyboard fanatic, you're going to want a USB mouse as well, so let's check that one. Now, that's all of the compulsory accessories that we're going to need, but optionally and recommended is a case to put your Raspberry Pi into. The main purpose of this is obviously to provide some protection to your Raspberry Pi. If you have a Raspberry Pi 4, you may wish to consider purchasing a case with a built-in fan, as the latest Pi, when you're putting it under load, things tend to get a bit toasty. Alternatively, if you're fortunate enough to own your own 3D printer, you could even print a case. There's some excellent 3D models available to download for free from the Thingiverse website. Now, unless you're lucky enough that your PC or laptop already has a micro USB card slot in it, you're also going to need a micro SD card to USB adapter, but you can pick one of these up pretty cheaply from the likes of Amazon. Okay, and lastly, if you're not planning on using the built-in Wi-Fi on your Raspberry Pi, but you still plan on using the internet, you'll be needing an Ethernet cable. Previous generations of Raspberry Pi came with a fixed amount of RAM. For example, the Raspberry Pi 3 was only available with 1GB of memory. Being a single board computer where the components are all fixed on board, it's also the case that the latest Raspberry Pi, the Model 4, also comes with a fixed or unchangeable amount of RAM on board. However, for the first time with the Pi 4, you can now choose how much RAM you would like when you order it. So there's a 1GB model as before, but it's now also available in 2 and 4GB configurations. And if you intend to use the Pi with a graphical desktop, effectively like as you would do a standard PC, you're probably going to want to opt for the 4GB version, which is what we'll be using in this video. So what about the operating system? Well, unlike the more mainstream computers running Windows or Mac OS, the Raspberry Pi tends to use various flavours of Linux. Now, don't be intimidated by this, it's relatively easy to get up and running, as I'll demonstrate in this video. Now, if you're at all familiar with the Raspberry Pi, you've probably heard things like NOOBS and Raspbian when it comes to software. I've even heard people ask which should I install, NOOBS or Raspbian. So let's just quickly clear that one up. Raspbian is actually an operating system. In fact, it's the operating system that is officially recommended by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to install on your Raspberry Pi. NOOBS, on the other hand, which is actually an acronym standing for New Out of Box Software, is actually a system designed to make the installation of an operating system easier for beginners. So you can basically think of it as an operating system installer, so it helps you choose between different operating systems and pick one to install. In fact, we could have used NOOBS to install Raspbian, which is the method I'd have demonstrated not that long ago. But as luck would have it, there's now an even easier way, using a tool called the Raspberry Pi Imager. So now that we've covered the groundwork, let's go use that. Right, first things first, let's open up a web browser and we're going to search for Raspberry Pi, and we're looking for this entry here, raspberrypi.org. This is the official website of the Raspberry Pi. You'll find all sorts of useful things on here, so spend some time having a look round. For our purposes though, we're going to go to the Downloads tab and click there. Now here at the top we've got links to download the Raspberry Pi Imager, and as you can see it's cross-platform, so we've got Windows at the top, you've got a Mac OS link there, or even Ubuntu on Linux there at the bottom. So I'm going to click the Windows version and download that to the downloads directory. So we can come out of Chrome or whatever web browser you happen to be using, and I'm going to go to File Explorer and pull it over a bit, locate my download, and you can see there we've got the Imager that we just downloaded. So let's double click it to begin the installation and say yes to continue. Then we need to click this install button and let it go through the installer, and nice and quick like that. It's a little program, so it's installed, and we can leave the box checked to run it automatically when we click finish. Right, so I can close File Explorer, and that just leaves us with the Raspberry Pi Imager. If you haven't already, you need to make sure that you've connected your micro SD card to your PC or laptop, so let's do that now. Okay, and then we need to choose here the operating system we want to install, which we're going to do Raspbian here at the top of the list. And then we're going to click this button to choose our SD card, which there you go, it's showing mine there, which is a 32GB Kingston. And then I'm going to click on the write button. So this process will take a little while, so I'll pause the video and come back once it's completed. Right, so it's finished writing Raspbian to our micro SD card, and as it says there on the screen, we can now remove the SD card from the reader and click continue. And when we've done that, we can close the Raspberry Pi Imager, and that's it. We now have Raspbian on our micro SD card ready to boot the Raspberry Pi from. Okay, connect your keyboard, mouse and monitor to your Raspberry Pi, put your micro SD card in and turn it on, and let it boot, and as you can see there, it's resizing the root file system before it reboots. And what that means is that at the moment the file system will only take up a small part of your microSD card. Once it's automatically done this process for us, you'll be able to use the full capacity of whatever size your microSD card is. So as you can see, we're now at the Raspberry Pi desktop, and it's automatically launched this wizard for us, and it's basically going to guide us through a few things to get us set up and running. So if we start by clicking the next button here. So these settings are good for me, but if you need to change yours to reflect your country, language and time zone, do so here, and then click next. And so it's setting up our location. And now, because the default password Raspberry is obviously not very secure, it wants me to enter another one, so let's do that and confirm it, and I'm going to click next to continue. And basically at this point, if your screen is showing black bars around the edge, which if we pan out you can see mine is here, you can check this box to get rid of it. So I'm going to tick that, and what that will do when I click next here, it will tell it on the next reboot to remove that border. So what it's doing at this point is looking for Wi-Fi networks. So this is where, if you wanted to, you could join onto your Wi-Fi network, or if you've got your Pi plugged in using an Ethernet cable, then obviously you can skip this step. So I'm going to connect an Ethernet cable to my Pi now, and hopefully in a second you should see on the screen it detects the cable. There we go. So that's it, my Ethernet port is, the link is up, and so it should now start talking to the network and the internet. So I can skip this part because I don't want to use Wi-Fi, and the first thing it's going to do is go out and look for updates for the software to make sure everything's nice and up to date to get you going. So click next there, and this may take a little while, so I'm going to pause the video and come back once the process is complete and it's updated. And when you get to the end of that, as it tells us here, the system is now up to date, so we can click OK. And as it suggests, it's best really to restart the Pi now for it to all take effect, so let's do that. Okay, that's more like it, so the screen is now set up correctly. And congratulations, that's basically it. You've installed the Raspbian desktop operating system on your Raspberry Pi. So let's take a look round and familiarise ourselves with the interface. So if we go up to the top left to this Raspberry Pi icon, you can click that for the drop down list, and this is effectively your start menu. So you can see that the software is grouped into categories. So we've got a programming one at the top, we've got an internet browser, Chromium, which is the open source version of Google Chrome, installed for us. We've got sound and video, we've got the excellent VLC media player installed, ready to go. We've got an image viewer under graphics, we've got some accessory utility programs in there. There's a help section. We have preferences. This is where we could launch the add and remove software package manager. So effectively this is where you would install extra software if you wanted to. So if I was to click a category down here on the left, it will pull in a list of the software that's available. Or alternatively, if I know what I'm looking for, let's say I wanted gedit, if I type that in here, this is just a text editor, a bit like Notepad in Windows. So if I type that and press enter, it's going to search for gedit. And as you can see there, we've got the official text editor for the GNOME desktop environment, which, as it says there, is gedit. So if I wanted to install that, I would check the box and then click apply. and it goes out and downloads the software and then installs it for us. And that's it, it's got it, so we can click OK. And if I now come up to the menu and look under accessories, we should see we'd already got the, I think it's mousepad in Raspbian, which is the default text editor, but we've also now got the gedit one that I just installed, so it's added it to the menu for us. So I can come out of there. If we go back to the Raspberry Pi menu, so obviously that was under preferences, and you've got options to change the appearance and alter your keyboard and mouse and various things in here. A useful one is the Raspberry Pi configuration. So in here on the system tab, if we wanted to change our password, that's where we would do it. We can change the host name, the name of our Raspberry Pi computer, which by default is just Raspberry Pi. It's set to boot to this graphical desktop, but you could have it boot to the command line instead if you'd sooner. It's also set to auto login when it boots. If you want to be a bit more secure, you can uncheck that and then it'll ask for your password when it boots. If we look on the display tab, you can see here this overscan, that's where we control the black borders on our screen. So you can see it's now turned them off for me to remove them, but if you were having issues with your black borders, that's where you'd set it in here to enable or disable it. If we look at the interfaces tab, there's all sorts of options in here, so SSH might be a good option if you want to remotely log into the terminal on your Pi. This is where you can enable it here. VNC is a bit like Windows Remote Desktop, so you can turn that on here. At the top we've got the camera. You can buy the official Raspberry Pi camera add-on if you'd like to use that with your Raspberry Pi, and that connects via a ribbon cable to your Raspberry Pi. You would enable that here if you purchase one of those. You've got the performance tab, which on here you've got a GPU memory allocation. So obviously your GPU is your graphics memory, so you can assign how much you want to allocate to that. And then we've got the localization tab. So if you want to change any of the settings that you set for your locale, your time zone, your keyboard, even your Wi-Fi country, if you're using Wi-Fi, you would set those in here. So let's click OK to come out of that. Back on the start menu, underneath the preferences and below the Raspberry Pi configuration, we've got recommended software. This is useful because it's the software that's obviously recommended by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to use with your Pi, and it's grouped handily into categories for us, so very easy to install. If you wanted one, you would just click the checkbox to select it and then click the OK button, but we don't need to do that now. Then next on the start menu we've got Run, which is very similar to the run box on Windows, so if you want to execute a command you can do that in there. And then lastly at the bottom of the start menu we've got Shutdown, so obviously when we want to turn our Pi off, that's where we would do it here. Okay, you can also see on the desktop you've got a trash can, which is pretty obvious what that does. You've got these shortcut icons up here on the taskbar. So you've got your web browser to launch that, you've got a file manager to go into the file system and have a look through. You can see pretty similar to Windows, it splits things into usable folders, so we've got documents, downloads, music, pictures, just as you would have on the Microsoft operating system. We've then got a shortcut to the terminal, which if you're getting into programming and looking under the hood and seeing how the Raspberry Pi really works, this is going to be invaluable. And then over here on the top right we've got a Bluetooth icon, because the Raspberry Pi, as well as inbuilt Wi-Fi. It's also got a Bluetooth module in there as well, so that can be handy to join to other devices. You've got your network drop down tab. Then next along we've got this speaker icon, so if we click that, we've got a slider to adjust the volume on our Raspberry Pi. And then finally on the top right we've got the clock, and if we were to click that, we've got this drop down with the date as well. And that's about it. To get you started and thinking in the right direction, if you go back to the start menu and have a look under help and projects, if you were to click that, that will launch the Chromium web browser and will actually take you to the Raspberry Pi website, to the projects section. So as you can see, it's grouped into categories. So for example, if you were to have a look in games, and at the top here you can choose your hardware. So obviously we've got a Raspberry Pi, and then having a look in here, there's all sorts of projects of things that are possible using the Raspberry Pi. So this is an excellent resource to get you thinking and started with your Pi. As you'll soon discover, pretty well the sky is the limit, and in fact the only limit really is your imagination, because the Pi is capable of all sorts of wonderful things. So let's come out of that and let's shut down our Raspberry Pi. So go to there and click shut down. Well, if you're anything like me, you'll quickly discover that one Raspberry Pi isn't enough. But fortunately, as they're such an affordable device, you could pick up a couple more. To put it in perspective, you'd probably have to pick up about 10 of the little things before you got anywhere near the price of a half-decent laptop. They even do a Raspberry Pi Zero, which is a lot cheaper than the standard Raspberry Pi, and depending on your needs, possibly for a smaller project, one of those might be just the job. Of course, the other option is, because the microSD card is effectively your hard drive, you could purchase multiple microSD cards and then install something different on each of them, and then when you want to use a particular one, boot your Raspberry Pi from that, and then when you want to do something else, you just take that out and put another microSD card in with something else on it. Another thing definitely worth a quick mention is the GPIO pins on the Raspberry Pi, because this is what really sets the Pi apart from a standard computer. These can effectively be used and programmed to interact with all sorts of electronics kit. Of particular note are a range of devices known as HATs, which stands for hardware attached on top. These offer all sorts of additional functionality to your Raspberry Pi, and mostly these add-on boards connect directly to the GPIO pins. Just in case you're still scratching your head as to what else you can do with a Raspberry Pi, here's a few ideas on the screen. Well, that about brings us to the end of this video. I hope it's piqued your interest and given you a good starting point from which to begin your journey into the fabulous world of the Raspberry Pi. As always, if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, and if you'd like to be notified when I post the next one, just click the bell icon. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.